Graham Nichols.
I'm Mark Bentham.
I am Katie Holloway, and you are listening to Ordinary. Hello, happy Tuesday, everyone. Well, happy Friday, listeners, or you can listen to us any day of the week. We don't mind.
Happy days.
You two spend too much time together.
And they are all happy days.
Oh, great.
Indeed.
Do you ever finish each other's sentences?
All the
Not
time.
too much.
I'm getting
We
mixed.
obviously finished them differently then, so that was good.
Yeah. Nice.
Purposely,
So
we
I
did
do
that.
have this thing where I sometimes can't work out whether I've told Caroline or Mark some piece of information.
Oh, no.
That's about as close as it gets. But every other said, was it you I was talking to you, Mark, or was it Caroline?
Yeah.
So that
Two
occasionally
main relationships in your life, I suppose.
No, the only two people who are willing to listen to me for
Is that
longer
what it
than 5
is?
minutes.
Yeah. And the listeners of Ordinary.
Well, indeed. Yes. They don't have to listen to me all the time, though. That's the good thing
They
about
can
Ordinary.
pause you or turn you off, yeah. But please don't, dear reader, dear listener. It's quite a week this week. We've got two, which I previously knew all about, two anniversaries of it's
Three anniversaries, isn't it?
What's the third?
Isn't it your anniversary?
Oh,
this
yeah, it's
week,
my
is it?
wedding anniversary this week as well, yeah.
So it's three anniversary.
Yeah, I've been part of Hayward Heath for a decade now.
So your wedding
and my
anniversary is 10
marriage.
years.
It is, yeah.
10. And then 20 years ago was the starting of the Second Iraq War, which was more the invasion in order to capture potentially chemical
Weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
According to the dodgy dossier. And I think it was game-changing in that I think it changed the reputation of the West and to some degree the influence of the West in the Middle East for the worse. And it was, in the end, a terrible time for Christians. So it is a kind of sad anniversary because it wasn't good really for the Middle East and it wasn't good for Christians in Iraq, who strangely perhaps were not terribly persecuted under Saddam Hussein. It was a sort of secular Muslim country where Christians weren't particularly persecuted. Whereas when it was kind of liberated, it got a bit worse, or quite a lot worse for Christians. So that was sad. So that's one anniversary.
Yeah. What's the other one?
The other one is the
I know what it is. I'm just asking.
beginning of lockdown, the very first lockdown, the first lockdown we would have ever experienced in our lives, where we were confined to our homes. Never happened before in pretty much any country, but right across the West it happened, and it happened in this country just after Mothering Sunday. It all clamped down on us.
And that's 3 years, isn't it? I did that thing that I think lockdowns did to all of us, where time's completely warped, and I can't remember how. Like, if you told me it was 5, I'd believe you. If you told me if it was 1, I'd probably believe you. So that's been quite culture changing as well, or at least community changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's done one or two things for the good in that it's got technology more used and usable. I've got lots more used to, but it's having sort of a bad tail, as in tail end, in the sense there are still people who are very nervous and paranoid. There are people that I think are still really hurt by things that happened during that time and a bit confused.
Yeah.
And some open questions as to whether it was justified, but the state imposing that kind of restriction was definitely a thing.
Yeah.
Got Christians in a good way thinking about what's the nature of the church and what's it all mean. Did you enjoy lockdown, Mark?
Secretly, I did the first lockdown. It was actually quite a nice time. Truth be known,
The weather was nice, wasn't it?
weather was nice.
During that first one,
I think there was, it was different. Changed things. Yeah.
It's different. Not
It
to
broke the rhythm of life. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was the part of time when we were in. In one sense, I wasn't out. Lots of evenings. Had time with the family.
Yeah.
There were lots of positives, even in the midst of it all.
I think it very much depended what stage of life you're at, how lockdown went.
I think that's right.
Because people were kept talking about loneliness and so much time on your own, and for me it was the exact opposite. I had all this time with my two young children. My son had just turned 2 just before, and it was like, here's a 2-year-old and no escape from him.
Yeah.
So it was very different for everybody. I think we all learned a lot about ourselves and our hearts and our idols.
Yeah, I think learned about personality types as well. I didn't think I was an extrovert in the sense of the sort of classic definition of sort of being energized by being with people or so forth. I would have thought Caroline, my wife, was more. So although she was pretty relaxed, she's relaxed with people and not with people, whereas I'm kind of like, oh, I want to get out and see somebody and stuff. I did enjoy painting the shed and doing a few other things in the first lockdown, because there was a sort of novelty and it was all right. As it dragged on, I think it was more difficult for all different categories of people.
The winter ones were a lot harder.
Yeah.
Ones. How many were there? I don't even remember. I feel like there was
2, was there?
Was it just 2?
Well,
it feels
2
like
with
more.
lots of restrictions in between. There was
like
effective
mini
lockdowns
ones.
in between.
Yeah.
There was rule of 6 and various other things that happened for a long time.
It's all a blur. I think I've blocked it out like some psychological trauma thing.
It was only about a year ago that things got kind of released.
Yeah, last January, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
January 22.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember wearing a face mask at a wedding, actually, which wasn't much more than a year ago.
Yeah, the whole famous face masks.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, I got an email from my dentist today to say that I no longer have to wear a face mask in the waiting room. So
I was
good
going
to
to
catch up.
from your dentist. My dentist told me he no longer wanted me because, he's not doing NHS anymore.
Yeah.
Quite so. Well, we could do a podcast with a rant against dentists.
Yeah.
Which I could join in on.
Right.
But we won't.
I was still
what are we
allowed
going to
in,
do,
right.
Katie?
Well, we're going to answer a question from one of our readers. Why do I keep saying readers? Because I usually write things rather than speak. One of our listeners. We're going to answer a question about communion, and then we're going to talk about the cross, and specifically looking at the cross and what we mean by that. So let me read you this question, followed up from last week. If you've got a question, do email us, ordinary@cchh.org.uk. The question is about communion. As it is a remembrance meal ordained by the Lord Jesus himself, should our prayers at the communion table always be directed to him? Are prayers thanking our Father appropriate? Who wants to have a bash at that?
Yes.
Graham, it's yours.
No, yes. And yes and yes. Yes, I want to answer the question.
Oh, that was the answer, as well as saying you want to bash it.
I think praying to the Father is appropriate. In one sense, because it's always appropriate, praying to the Father in the name of the Son. I think it's appropriate because Jesus gives thanks to the Father in the Jesus broke bread and gave thanks. Well, who did he give thanks to? God the Father. So I don't, as a practice, have a total prayer that's all to the Lord Jesus. I don't think that's generally appropriate. Well, it's not inappropriate, so I don't think that's just good practice. I wouldn't have a whole prayer that's just to Jesus, because I think the general pattern is to pray to the Father in the name of the Son. I think it's not inappropriate to exchange thanks to the Son, perhaps in particular as we direct our thoughts, but that's not generally how we pray. Is that true, Mark?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously you can pray to the Father, the Son and the Spirit.
Yes.
Each are equally God, so
yes.
Each are equally, and it's appropriate at times to do so. But I think there is an element, isn't there, as well, just in how salvation is worked. It originates in the Father in one sense, of which the Son then submits. So there is a sense whereby you are still praying to the Father, thanking him for that work. But it wouldn't be inappropriate, as Graham said, to thank the Lord Jesus. And I think at the end of the day, what are you primarily praying around the communion table? You are praying prayers of thanks, but generally you're also praying prayers pastorally for people, which I think therefore means you still go to the Father through the Son by the Spirit.
Yeah, that's helpful. There we go. Hope that answered your question, dear listener. Yes, let's jump into where we are today. Looking at the cross. So today we're thinking about the cross, nearly Easter, good time to think about it. I wanted to unpack, if we can, a little bit, the phrase, look to the cross. I feel like this is kind of like a Christian shorthand for something. It might be good to delve into what we mean when we say look to the cross. I guess I feel like I've heard the phrase in sermons quite a lot, usually quite near the end, maybe as part of the application. So what do we mean when we say look to the cross? Like, if it's a sermon application, for instance, what do you mean? Mark, why don't you delve into it a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think, as you kind of are suggesting, context is everything when we mean by that. I think when we're talking about look to the cross, often in the sermon application, we're talking about look to the cross for forgiveness, salvation. Yeah. You're looking to what the cross has achieved in the sense of winning us, as it were, salvation, forgiveness of sin, reconciliation with the Father, adoption into the family, peace with God. So it kind of conflates a lot of what we talk about as the doctrine of salvation. In the same way when Paul talks about Titus 2, God our Saviour, is kind of shorthand for all that the doctrine of salvation. And at the end of the day, Christianity is a doctrine of salvation. We're kind of surmising all of that in that little phrase, because at the cross is where it was all won and achieved for us. It's where all the promises are fulfilled. So it's the centre of our faith.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Do you want to add something at that kind of level, Graham?
That look is often in the Bible an idea of behold and contemplate.
Yeah.
So probably historically it sort of comes into sort of usage because you are thinking about contemplating the whole thing about the cross, both the kind of history and the significance of it. I think it's also true that there's lots of phrases about the cross that we are shorthand. Like we might say, sins are forgiven at the cross, or go to the foot of the cross, or there's other ways. And we have to have made sure we've explained what we meant by that, rather than just, particularly these days, to not assume that people understand.
Yeah. But I think what we're not saying is kind of fixate on the physical sufferings of Christ, because although that is a part of it, the reality is the gospel writers don't really fixate on that. They're quite matter of fact about it. They don't kind of go into all the gruesome detail that they could have done about what happens in crucifixion, but they do just kind of fix onto what is actually the significance of what Christ is doing on the cross, and explaining the kind of the events around it and surrounding it that kind of lead us to understand the significance of it.
Is it ever appropriate to stop and dwell on the horror and the gore and just the pain of the cross?
Yeah, I think there are times when it is appropriate, because it's part of it. It's part of the cost that Christ bore for us. It's part of his suffering. But I think what happens is if we get fixated on that, we neglect actually which was the greater suffering for him, which was the sense of the reality of the wrath of his Father bearing upon him for our sin. So it's not wrong to, but I wouldn't want to stop there. And I think sometimes we can move into kind of seeing the suffering, the physical suffering, and somehow think that was worse for him than the spiritual suffering of being separated from his Father. So I think that's where we want to be careful.
Yeah, I think Psalm 22 is an interesting model of that, where David looks forward in the sense of prefigures the suffering of Christ, and it begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? There are some descriptions of the agony and the sort of the physical pain in that psalm, but there's a lot more of David in this case kind of reflecting on why is this happening, and the sense of what he used to know, what he doesn't know now, what he anticipates. So there's much more theological reflection really in that psalm rather than a whole description. So there is some. So I think it's all right to have some physical description, but I think that the bulk of that psalm is not to do with that. It's to do with what's going on.
Yeah, that's helpful. Are there any other misconceptions that even Christians might have about the cross? Like that, you just said, Mark, it is really important to dwell on the physical aspect of it. So that might be a misconception. Are there any others that you've come across or that we might hold to?
Well, I mean, there's misunderstandings of the nature of the cross. So where people see it as it's just an example,
Yeah.
So it's an example of sacrifice. A miss, again, the substitutionary atonement side of things, where Christ has taken our place for our punishment. Others, there is so many. There are other theories. There's a ransom theory. He's paid just for, to set us free from Satan. Again, just a misunderstanding. So there's lots of ways we can misinterpret what's going on in the cross, and many have over the centuries. And actually, I think in our day, particularly, the kind of misunderstanding would be that of one that has been put forward. It's not so recent, it's probably about 10 years ago, isn't it, that it came out in real opposition to atonement, was this idea that actually on the cross this was child abuse, that this was the father abusing his son, if the atonement language was used. And I think that's just a misunderstanding or misinterpretation or just plain wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Graham's looking ponderous.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to say something very profound based on
the the person who wrote the book, Steve Chalk, about the misunderstandings about Christ would, I've forgotten the name of the lost message of Christ, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, lost message.
Yeah. Would say, that's not the way to understand it, because it was, I think he kind of goes down the victory line, I think.
An exemplary.
A little bit of the example line and a bit of the kind of victory, although not really sort of well defined quite what victory it was and how the victory was achieved.
Well, victory over evil and power, isn't it? And kind of using the Colossians 2 language.
Yeah, but it's how that was achieved, and he doesn't it doesn't relate to the Colossians language, which and the rest of the Paul's writings in terms of the sin being nailed to the cross and so on, and it being somehow connected with punishment, justice, judgment, removal of sin, all those kind of things. But yeah, I think it's not sort of to be underrated, the fact that I know there's certain people, which is good in lots of ways, where if I preach something about the cross and describe it, there is a kind of an emotional reaction which happens, and they'll always appreciate that, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, but there has to be sort of more than just the kind of emotional reaction to tragedy or suffering, because obviously there's a whole field of art, not that I'm at all into art, contemporary or ancient, but as in drawing art stuff, painting, but there's a whole school of art, isn't there, to do with crucifixion art and depicting that and getting into the kind of emotion of it by people who probably have mostly not some great conception of what theologically was going on, what was going on sacrificially. It's more just to do with here's a dramatic moment that's really interesting to depict with paint, and you can get kind of drawn into the picture. I mean, if you see those at galleries and stuff, you kind of get drawn into the picture. And
I remember going to the National Gallery with my kids a couple of years ago. I think my daughter was 5 or 6, and we were looking around them, and she was actually quite distraught. We had to move away because she was getting quite upset by it all, actually, because they are quite, emotional. And it was hard to have that conversation with her to say, well, this is, because other parents will be like, oh, it's just a picture, it doesn't mean anything. But obviously we know it's not just a picture, it does mean something. So that was a really interesting moment, actually, to discuss that with her. Like, actually, yes, it did. It was like that, I'm not sure of the value of that compared with reading the biblical text.
Yeah. Yes, it's a whole interesting question.
If you've got an answer to that, I don't know. But
No, I think it's an interesting question as to why God, in His sovereignty, chose to reveal the cross and the sort of centre of the plan of salvation in a time of written, not in the video age in which we're in, where everything would be propagated in a different way.
Yeah.
So I obviously it's a God thing to decide when to do that, but then you could reason that there might be great value in simple words being the primary way that God reveals the message to His followers, and not in sort of video longs, video shorts, and
but
multimedia presentations.
Art's slightly different than the video, isn't it? Like, there is interpretation. There's something else going on in there.
Yeah.
You know, and actually there's a creative element to it.
Yeah.
You know, that there is, you know, there's a reason why there is a huge amount of art around the biblical, you know, narratives, and particularly the cross, because it is such a profound event. You know, lots of it was done in a period of belief. You know, it wasn't that it's a sense of people were doing it out of, this was just interest. You know, there was a profound sense this was for many, you know, this is true, this is what I believe, and trying to capture something of the horrific nature of what Christ endured for us.
Yeah.
But it's hard to capture that. I think that's because without kind of just focusing on the physical suffering, trying to capture something of the spiritual as well.
Yeah, and much medieval art as well was it's pre-Reformation, so it's before the time when people could actually read the Bible to themselves. So it did have that role of telling the stories on, you know, stained glass windows and paintings and stuff.
We're sounding like we almost know what we're talking about to do with the history of art, which I don't think...
I did an A-level in history of art back in the day.
Did you?
So I did, yeah, it's fascinating.
Do you know what you're talking about?
I do, yeah. I mean, an A-level, that's a long time ago. Even though I am only 20, it's still a long time ago.
It's a long time. It's longer for some.
Yeah.
I think other parts of the Bible lend themselves more easily to art, where you can... I'm not saying they're all perfect, but the other stories are a bit more kind of straightforward to depict. And you can sort of show expressions and sort of the juxtaposition of various people, and it kind of tells a story in a way that's harder at the cross because of this great cosmic significance of it.
Yeah.
But it can cause me to reflect, you know, and it can slow me down to reflect, to perceive something in a way that I don't necessarily always get through just reading it. You know, we are creative beings, aren't we? The Lord has allowed it. That which is done well and tastefully can actually draw me to perceive something of what Christ has done in a fresher, newer way. Yeah.
Is that why even the most kind of plain of church, like the ones that we go to, that though we don't have much decoration stuff, we always have a cross? Is that the reason for that?
We don't even
have
a cross.
Oh no, you don't even have a cross because you're in a school hall.
So we didn't even have one in our building.
I'm just thinking of the logo.
People wanted us to have one. I think people wanted us to have one, and we used to have one.
Is there not one? No, there's not, is there? There's just a pod. Oh, don't even have one. Okay, here's the next question then. Should you have one?
Well, you know, I'm not opposed, but I think, you know, it. Yeah,
I think that's the problem.
I don't think you have to have one. I don't think biblically you should. Yeah. I think the kind of reason why, you know, what is the purpose? I don't think you should have a crucifixion. I don't think it's a good thing to have Christ on the cross because the work is finished.
So why don't we have a crucifix up?
I think because it tends towards more an idolatrous view of the cross, and it tends to be an object that you kind of worship and venerate. And, you know, people kind of often curtsy or kneel at the cross, don't they? Or sign themselves with the cross. So it's more associated with that kind of worshipping it as an object in and of itself, and focuses on just the crucifixion and not the resurrection. The great thing about a plain cross is that it reminds you of the death of Christ, but also the fact that he's not on the cross anymore. Yeah. And so I think it's better from that sense, which makes me chuckle, because I'm thinking, why haven't we got one then in that case if it's that good? Yeah. But I'm with Mark in that I suppose we're a bit ambivalent, if you can be a bit ambivalent. We're just ambivalent. Which is why we haven't made a big effort to put one up, but we wouldn't be worried if there was one up.
I think the truth is for us, there's just a functional answer. In our church building, it was a multi-purpose building. There wasn't a place where you could have the cross where it wasn't going to get damaged. So in the end, it was kind of, it's not an essential part of our worship to have a cross up. If I was in a building whereby you weren't using it multi-purpose the whole time, you may well have a cross up as a kind of a mark of you know, it is the symbol of Christianity. The empty cross. Sign. Yeah. On the back of cars.
I'm still wondering why I never noticed that there's not one. I'm wondering what that says about me. Why is
it kind of makes the point?
Yeah. Why is the cross the thing? Why is it not an empty tomb or that fish thing? And why no, that's a different question. I don't go there. Why is it the cross?
I think about the empty tomb, but I think the resurrection is a big thing that the disciples spoke about in the book of Acts. So I think we don't say it's just about the cross and not about the empty tomb and not about the resurrection. So I think it's all those things. But in terms of the great transaction and the moment at which the salvation of sinners was made possible is the cross. And so the New Testament writers, although they talk a lot about the resurrection, talk a lot equally about the cross as the kind of turning point of history.
Yeah.
And they talk about glorying in the cross, by which they do mean the whole thing, I think, the death and resurrection of Christ, but particularly focused on what was achieved at the cross. So I think
and the resurrection proves the cross, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, that's the, that without the resurrection, the cross is not proved. So it is both, but it then knocks us back to the crucifixion of where that, as Grant said, the transaction takes place.
Yeah.
So what is it then that is actually achieved at the cross? Can we unpack that a little bit? Must be Mark's turn.
Well, I think, what we have been saying is that on the cross, we wholeheartedly believe that Jesus died on our behalf. He bore the punishment for our sin. So he took on himself, as it were, the sin of our rejection of God. And on the cross, he bore that punishment that we rightly deserved. That punishment was death. The cross represented the curse of God, being under the curse of God. Deuteronomy 21, I think it is. So on that cross, he takes that. And for those hours, particularly when it was dark, he is bearing the punishment of God for our sin and in our place. So bringing us forgiveness, peace, acceptance, justification, adoption.
So is that what we mean by the word atonement?
Atonement, yeah. At one, he's taking our place that he atones for, pays the punishment for. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Does it have any other functions? Not. I realise that sounds quite clinical, but are there other things that were achieved on the cross, or is it simply about, though not simply because they're marvellous, but is that the summation of it?
I don't know if it's the summation of it, it's the centre of it.
Yeah.
In the substitutionary death and the penal part, the punishment part, are crucial to all the things that flow from it. But people who've overemphasised victory are wrong in the sense they haven't quite described what the victory is over. But once you've established that's what was happening, then other things flow from it. Like, yes, it was a supreme example of self-sacrifice. And yes, it was a demonstration of the love of God and the justice of God at the same time. And that it's possible for God to be both holy and loving, to be completely righteous and exercise mercy. So all those things kind of flow out. It defeats the power of Satan to accuse. So it's a victory in that sense. It's a victory over death in that eternal death is no longer our destiny. So it's a victory in that way. So all those things kind of flow out of it, and they're not minor. They're really significant, important things. But they flow out of the substitutionary atonement that happened.
Yeah, great.
And the defeat of all powers. Colossians 2. All enemies, defeat of evil, defeat of Satan. Satan's defeated at the cross. Disarmed.
So why don't you both sound a bit more excited when you're talking about this?
Well, I thought I was, but I think we're also
You're
trying
just in podcast mode.
No. It's also trying to get it the kind of the language precise.
Yeah.
So if you're preaching it,
you're concentrating.
You can take off a little bit more, but when you're trying to sort of think, got all these worthy theologians listening in, and you kind of want to, because words do matter when it comes to it.
They do. I'd like to do a podcast on that, actually. Language, that'd be really interesting. So how do we look to the cross then, especially as at Christchurch there isn't even a cross to look at? What does a Christian do when that is the application of a sermon?
Well,
no one wants to answer that.
Well, I think it starts, doesn't it? I think in one sense, when I'm looking to the cross, it's part of what I do every day as I read my Bible. It's thinking about what Christ has done for us. And as I do that, it causes me to confess my sin, to seek forgiveness for my sin, and to be reminded of the hope that I have, that I am cleansed, washed, renewed, restored, forgiven, adopted. And in that sense, because of the cross, I am forgiven, but I have a new identity as one who is in Christ and who is united to Christ and loved by Christ. And so in that sense, as I look to the cross, it's reminding me of where my hope is. It's reminding me of who I am. And it's reminding me, therefore, then how I live. So therefore, because my sin is forgiven, I'm putting to death my sin and putting on that which Christ has called me to live like, to be like him. So I think as I look to the cross, what I'm doing is in one sense, I'm preaching the gospel to my heart, as Joe Bridges would say, every morning, every day. I need to keep reminding. And when we talk about look to the cross, we're talking, do that. Live in light of the cross. Live in light of what Christ has done for you and in light of who Christ is and what that means for now who you are. And therefore, it's going to start to shape how I think, how I behave, how I pray, how I respond, and seeking to become more like Christ as I do that. Yeah.
So then what difference does that make in the believer's ordinary life if we are looking to the cross consistently? How does that help us as we struggle with anxiety or getting irritable with people or a medical diagnosis or an unfaithful spouse, all these kind of, different things, big and small? How does looking to the cross change things for us as we go through just normal life?
Yeah, well, obviously it's changed our whole direction, and that Paul talks about glorying or boasting in the cross.
Yeah.
So it's where we find our dignity and our worth and the thing that we put our trust in. So with all those different situations you mentioned, there's both how we feel about them, like how we respond to them, how we know that despite all these troubles, we are deeply loved, and that's seen at the cross. And we are completely justified, and that's seen at the cross. So it helps us kind of how we feel about them. It helps us then to kind of walk into those situations where there may be the need to forgive, there may be the need to keep going, there may be the need to stand up for justice, there may need to be loving. So it gives us lots of fundamental things about how we should be behaving, sacrificially but justly. And it also gives us a priority in that, not to say these things are trivial at all, but to say our priority is living for Christ and knowing Christ and speaking about Christ. And so we're not putting our trust in any of those things, but we're also trying to call other people to not put their trust in any of those things in and of themselves. That's a really shorthand way of thinking about lots of different, all those situations you mentioned are complex and, need unpacking in their own right. So it's not simply, you got this trouble, it doesn't matter because of the cross. But in a sense, that is true. But it needs a lot more kind of working through and accepting the pain of it, of the thing that we're going through, but also how we think about ourselves and how we think about others in response to that.
Yeah. And it's how Paul talks in Galatians 2, where he says, I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. So the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God. So if that reality is true because of the cross, then that begins to shape how I respond in all those situations, because I'm living with Christ and Christ is in me. So that gives me confidence over my fears. It gives me hope for my future, but it shapes then how I respond, because I'm responding as Christ would, because Christ lives in me and I have been crucified. My old self, sinful nature, is put to death. And I'm putting on that fruit of the new.
Yeah, great. I think that's probably all we've got time for. Are there any closing thoughts you'd like to add? Graham, I'm presuming you wouldn't tell someone who's suffering, oh, it doesn't matter because of the cross.
No, that was my point, really, that that I was saying, I was conscious, even though I was saying in longhand, that it was sounding like it was just as simple as, no, it doesn't matter whatever you're suffering because of the cross. And you'd given kind of a long list of different difficult circumstances that people have gone through. I'm thinking, we're kind of reeling off at about the same length the benefits of the cross. But obviously the pain is real that people are going through, and we mourn with people who mourn for whatever reason, whether it's an illness or a bereavement or a relational breakdown or a loss of job. We mourn with people who mourn, but we don't mourn in a hopeless way. The cross might help us navigate the right principles to work through in that situation, but the cross also gives us hope in that situation.
And the cross also just demonstrates that actually Christ understands my suffering. He has suffered. He knows what suffering is like. He knows the realities of suffering. He knows what it is to be alone. He knows what it is to be fearful. He knows what it is to be abandoned by friends and to suffer intensely. So in that sense, it gives me hope.
Yeah, great. It's a good note to end on. We'll see you next time.